Anthony Kim was regarded as one of the most talented young players in the game of golf. Comparisons were made to Tiger and Rory, and then he just disappeared after injury for a number of years and reappeared this year on Live Golf. So we've got two swings here, one from when he was at his peak, and then one from now at the start of the year. And we're going to take a look at his swing and just make some comparisons and see if he can get back to some of that form that he was at when he was at his peak. So if we look at setup position, very similar here, very similar posture in terms of the body angles, in terms of how the arms hang, and that's a real key. No matter what happens with your swing, you can always try and maintain a nice setup position here, and you can see Anthony has done that beautifully. Now in terms of his trigger move, that's very much the same. Watch his knee, how he sort of squats down there. You can see on the right hand side, still got that little squat. And then if we look at the torso, what we'll see is this right arm straightens and then this upper body opens up subtly. So you can see it there, little subtle open up. You can see it more on the right hand side. Really squats into that knee, straightens that right arm and opens up that body and chest subtly. So very similar in terms of that initial sort of pre-movement in terms of starting the swing. Let's have a look now at his takeaway. So you can see that little movement, and then he'll get a nice little bit of wrist set there. That right wrist is working nicely. Subtle amount of arm bend in the right arm. You'll see how that club head is outside his hands. Not a huge amount of hip turn, but he has set that right hip back a little bit there. And you'll notice as well that club face is in a nice square position in terms of his back line. Now, if we look at his swing now, you'll see a very similar action where he sets that wrist probably a little bit less if I'm being very picky. Yeah, it's hard to see with the different camera angle. Probably ever so slightly sets that wrist a little bit less on the right hand side, but you'll see that club face is nicely parallel to his spine. Club shaft is outside his hands. A little bit of movement in that hip back, but again, hip fairly stable there. So very similar, subtle amount of bend in that right arm. Very similar move there. So if we take him now up, you'll start to see how he sets that club very upright there. So he's using a lot of wrist there. You'll see a little bit of movement down through the left knee. Those hips rotate a little bit more. Let's get him to that lead arm parallel position there. And then let's see if he does the same move where that left knee, moves forward. Yeah, subtle amount, and you can really see how he's setting those wrists there. You can see similar amount of arm bend in both positions. Those hands, it's a different camera angle, so it's hard to see, but those hands are pretty much just behind the center of his chest there. Anthony was a little bit flatter in terms of setting the shaft plane. We can see it's just inside the ball on both of those. I know it's a pretty crude line there. And you'll see he's got a subtle amount of cup in that left wrist on both of those positions. So very similar there. Let's bring him up to the top of the swing, and this is where you'll see a lot of difference. So you'll see on the left how he sort of squats. Look at the reference point of that line, how he's squatting down. And if we look at the hips, you'll notice as he moves back, can you see he's moving back, but that belt buckle starts to move down already before he's finished the backswing. So you see how it's already moving down? So he's starting his lower body moving before the hands have reached the top of the swing. This, for me, is where he's probably not going to be as good in the modern era, just because he's not got that dynamic motion now. You can see there he still does have that little sit down, but it's a little bit later and it's no way near. If I just play these through dynamically, you'll see how it's not as dynamic. He still sits down, you can see with his head, he's still sitting down, but there's just not as much athleticism. You can really see how much those legs have really regained that that flexion as he's moved down. So if we just move him into that same position, you can just see how it's not as dynamic as it once was. And that's probably due to injury. Age is a lot older, obviously. As we all get older, we don't move as good. And, you know, I'm not sure what's happened with his injuries, but that could contribute. So obviously that's going to inhibit his amount of speed, but it also changes the way that club moves in transition. So if we watch on the right hand side, and then he gets it just a hair steeper, that shaft, whereas when he was at his prime, watch how much that shaft starts to pitch behind him. You can see there how that shaft just pitches ever so slightly. Look at the club head, how it shifts there. You see that subtle move? Whereas if we look on here, I know it's, let me just zoom out, see if we can get the club head. We've not got the club head, but we can look about the shaft and you can see how it just pitches almost in a straight line rather than that little loop behind him shallowing it out. So if we bring him down, you can see how that right arm as well is moving down that way just to create that shallowing motion. But a lot of that is through the dynamic motion through the hips, and you can really see here how much he's got that angle in that right knee. He still does it quite well, it's just not as dynamic, and you can really see how much more those hips have turned around the corner on when he was in his prime almost, and as a result he's just shallowed that club shaft a little bit more out. And then let's move him down to a similar position here, and you can really start to see the differences here. You can see how much more dynamic he is through the hips, where his hips are more square on, whereas here you can see they're almost right out towards the target here, and you can see how his right foot is up off the ground, whereas here it's pretty much planted. I mean, in terms of the positioning, again, very, very good position on the right hand side, but just no way near as dynamic as he was in his prime. And then if we bring it down here, you'll notice how that right arm's a little bit more out on top. So he's probably got some like weak, like slicey sort of flights in there, just a little bit more over the top sort of move. He's not over the top, but that's the kind of comparison I'd make to where in his prime, that right arm's a little bit more behind him, the club's a little bit more shallow, and you can really see through the hips here how much more dynamic he is through those hips, how that foot is much more off the ground, and he's just in a little bit better position when he was in his prime. And then you'll see here, you can see, look how much more that foot is off the ground. And I just want to make a little comparison point in terms of how the hips work and how much more dynamic. You'll really see how he pushes up off the ground. You can see his left, if you look at his left toe, how he's pushing through that left toe and then comes off it to move towards the heel. So he's creating this really dynamic motion there. Whereas if we look here, I mean, he still moves off that toe, but you'll see from the hips, there's no way near as much vertical force there. It's all pretty much just very, very level through the hip. I mean, it's still a great, great golf swing, but it's just no way near as dynamic. And then if we bring him through a few more frames, you can just see on the left how much more dynamic he looks. I mean, exit's very, very similar. Let's just bring him up to there. Again, he's probably playing a draw on the left hand side, and obviously a little bit more dynamic. So you can see how, because he's a little bit more on top of it here, he's just going to exit a little bit more upright with the hands. Let's bring him through. Very, very similar position in a lot of ways. I think he's probably just a little bit under it on the left hand side, so you can see how he kind of saves it with the right arm because he was a little bit under there. But I mean, it's still a fantastic swing. For me, his issue is that he's just no way near as dynamic. He can still hit it decent distance, but I just don't think we're ever going to see the Anthony Kim that we saw when he was battling Rory back when he first came out on tour. I just think he's lost that dynamic motion. I really, really hope that he gets his game back, but only time will tell, but he definitely needs to try and be a little bit more dynamic if he can be, and maybe get that club a little bit shallower on the downswing just to get back to his peak form. Fingers crossed for Anthony.